Hello, everyone, and welcome. As you get settled into the Zoom room, I want you to know that we are so thrilled that you are choosing to invest an hour of your life with us to learn on the topic of Mark Miller's new book, Culture Rules. It is coming almost exactly 1 month from today on March 7th, and we're really excited to be able to share a sneak preview of the content with you. As we get started, I do want to let you know about a few housekeeping items. First of all, we are thrilled to use the chat as a place to engage with you throughout today's event. So if you could take a moment and let us know where you're calling in from, we would love to be able to include you along the way today. I also want to let you know that this meeting is set up for captions. So in the event that turning on the captions would help increase your learning experience, we invite you and encourage you to use those captions. So welcome as you're coming in. It looks like we have folks from many of the states. Hopefully you guys down in Texas have experienced a thaw over the weekend. Welcome in Sweden. One more note, if you are logging in today as a part of your professional development, I hope you'll take a moment to let us know what organization you represent so that we can give a shout out to your organization. Welcome to my friend Jeff Harmon in New Jersey. Good to see you again. Christy is representing Crew. We've got some Chick-fil-A folks on the call today. It looks like we have somebody from Minnesota who's wintering in Orlando, which is a really, really smart move. Welcome from Benchmark Mortgage, Tri7 Services, SGS Main Point in Switzerland. It looks like we have quite an international audience. We've got someone from Leadership in a Box, someone from Top Gun Enterprises, Impact 360. So thanks to you who are telling us where you're calling in from. And we would invite you throughout today's event to put your questions and your comments in the chat. We will use the chat as a record of the engagement on this event. And so please feel free throughout the event to use the chat. And later on in today's broadcast, we will have a chance to take some of your questions. So thanks again for investing some time with us this afternoon. Before we go any further, I do want to take a moment to introduce my friend and client, Mark Miller. Culture Rules is Mark's 11th book. And in addition to writing many helpful, inspiring, and practical books about leadership, Mark is also the Vice President of High Performance Leadership at Chick-fil-A. And he is a husband, a dad, and a granddad, and has so many inspiring comments to share that even though I meet with Mark regularly, I brought a pen today so that I can take notes throughout the event. Now, you can take notes if you want to, but we will also have a recording available after this event in case you'd like to watch it again. So with that, Mark, I'm going to turn things over to you, and I will be back with you later in the hour for some Q&A.
Thank you, Becky. I am delighted to be with you. And as I read through the names and the locations in the chat, this is truly a global audience. And I am just so thankful for the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you. I'll say one more word of context. Becky mentioned that I do work at Chick-fil-A Incorporated here in Atlanta. I joined Chick-fil-A about 45 years ago. So it has been a fantastic journey. That'll be another conversation for another day, but it is that journey that led me to this moment. About 25 years ago, I began to focus the majority of my energy on serving our leaders. And our executive committee decided that it would be appropriate for me to share the things that we're learning here with leaders around the world. So I'm just so excited to be with you today. The book is called Culture Rules, and I want to begin by asking you to think about a workplace experience. And here's how I want to try this. We'll see if we can make technology work for us here. If your birthday is January through June, I want you to think about a great workplace experience from somewhere in your past. And I would like you to put words or phrases in the chat, attributes that describe that setting. If your birthday is July through December, I want you to think of an unpleasant workplace experience. And I want you to put words and phrases and attributes in the chat to describe that. Let's see what we've got. So we've got cared for, teamwork, transparency, collaboration, controlling, toxic. These are moving very, very fast. Low trust, Oh, there's toxic again, suspicious, negative. It feels like the negatives are outweighing the positives. Come on, January through June, give me some supportive. What have we got? What have we got? Excellence, valued, empathetic. Okay, there's toxic again. Guess what you just described? You just described culture, whether it was good or whether it was bad, whether it was soul enriching or soul crushing. You described culture. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, let me start with a blinding flash of the obvious. Culture is hard. Culture is hard. I want to acknowledge that. I want to honor that. If you are in a leadership position and you're struggling with this topic, it's hard for several reasons. David Foster Wallace, the novelist and philosopher, tells this story. He said there are two young fish swimming along, and they're met by an old fish swimming towards them. As they approach, the older fish says, "How's the water, boys?" And they look at each other and they just kind of keep swimming, and they go a little bit further, and one of the young fish turns to the other one and he says, "What the hell is water?" I think that's the first reason culture is so hard. We have water blindness. We're in the midst of it, and we often can't even see it to know whether it's helping us or hindering us. But that's not the only reason culture is hard. It's also kind of squishy. At least that's the perception. But I want to challenge you, and I want to encourage you today that culture doesn't have to be squishy. It can be strategic. And for it to be strategic, you need to have a definition, because clearly it is an unseen force. However, that force is comprised of what people see, hear, experience, and believe. And that's the good news, because leaders are the primary influencers of what people see, hear, experience, and believe. But there are other reasons that it's hard. Every culture is unique, so the formulas tend to fall short. They're just different. They're different in a school than a sports team, than a manufacturing plant. They're just different, and that uniqueness creates challenges. One more challenge I'll mention here in the moment is you never stop working on culture. So all of these, and you could make a much longer list, make culture challenging. So why would you work on it? Well, you work on it because you know it's important. We did a survey of leaders and frontline associates, I might add, around the world. We looked at 10 countries. We had over 6,000 people in our sample. And you know what they told us? 72% of the leaders said that culture is the primary driver of performance. Let that settle for just a minute. And again, I'm assuming you would represent the world. 7 out of 10 of you today would say culture is the primary driver of results. It drives sales, profits, customer satisfaction, general levels of execution, retention. Culture, as Peter Drucker said, eats strategy for breakfast. It is the most important thing that you can work on in your organization. But here's the tragedy. That same research revealed that when you ask leaders to rank their priorities, creating and maintaining culture comes in number 12. Number 12 in your list of priorities. Again, let that sit for just a minute. You acknowledge that it's the number one driver of performance, and yet it's number 12 on your priority list. Well, that's tragic for many reasons, but not the least of which is that our overarching finding from the research is that leaders animate culture. Leaders animate culture. But leaders just told us they're actually not working on culture, which might explain some of those toxic experiences that you outlined in the chat. It's not that leaders don't have an intellectual assent toward the topic. There's insufficient time on task. So my team went to work and said, okay, how can we help close that gap? We're not really trying to convince leaders that culture is important. There's plenty of hard data and experiential data that leaders know culture is important. But how do we help close the gap? And we're saying, well, could we simplify this without making it simplistic? And we debated this for months. And let me tell you, when I had a personal breakthrough, we were studying the Navy SEALs. Now, we've studied them before. They're a good example of a lot of things. But the moment of clarity for me was the Navy SEAL mantra: to shoot, move, and communicate. Now, the SEALs would tell you that's not all you need to know to be a successful SEAL, but it is what you need to survive to fight another day. And so we began to think, is there some way to take all of this truth that we've unearthed and discovered about culture and reduce it to the most simple form possible? Not that it would be everything that a leader would ever need to know about culture, but what are those essential actions that only the leader can take? And so what I want to do here in the next few minutes is give you a 50,000-foot flyby of what we actually discovered, how we translated it, and ultimately it became a book. So we were inspired by the men and women that design games. There's a concept that they use called the magic circle. And to create that magic circle, you want to create a place where people will enter in freely. They'll suspend their preconceived notions. They'll engage fully and actually have fun in the process. Think about Monopoly or any of the games that you play. A game designer created a magic circle. And in essence, that's what you're trying to do with your culture. You're trying to create that place that people will enter in freely, perhaps suspend some of their preconceived notions, engage fully, and maybe they could even have fun in the process. And so, as we began to study game design, we said, what are the rules? And that was the moment when we said, what are the rules? What's the equivalent of shoot, move, and communicate for culture? And we came up with 3. Now, that's good news for me. If there were 12 rules, I'm not sure that I could get my head around it. But we identified 3 rules. Now, one more word about that. There are only 3 rules, but there are infinite moves. So think about your favorite sport. Let's use football as an example. The forward pass is allowed by rule. However, the number of routes that the receivers can run are infinite. So today, I'm going to give you a quick look at the 3 rules and a few of the moves just to illustrate the point. So let's look at rule number 1. The first culture rule is to aspire. Aspire. And what that means is to share your hopes and dreams for your culture. It is amazing how many leaders we surveyed and interviewed who could not articulate clearly and succinctly their aspiration for their culture. One of the stories we tell in the book is about the Ford Motor Company. When they had a new CEO come in just a few years ago, Mulally was his name. And he had come from Boeing. He had worked on the 727, 737, 747, all the airplanes up to the 777. And when he showed up at Ford, he made an unprecedented decision to keep the senior leadership team. It's like, well, why in the world would you do that? I mean, aren't they the problem? He said, no, they're talented, gifted men and women. He said, what we've got here is a culture problem. And he went about starting with the aspiration. And he came up with this concept of one Ford. He said, let's align people around what we're trying to accomplish. There's something so powerful about aligning people. Now, You may have heard terms such as vision and mission or purpose or values or even ethos. All of these could be used to help articulate your aspiration. They're all tools. They're tools at your disposal. Those would be an example of the various moves that you can make in an attempt to clarify your aspiration, to share your hopes and dreams. But don't miss the point. Clarity is your friend here. Here's a test. We shared this information with our Chick-fil-A operators just last week. And I said, here's the test of your cultural aspiration. Is it clear? Is it simple? And is it repeatable? Is it clear? Is it simple? And is it repeatable? Now, let me give you one quick cautionary note. When you start sharing your aspiration, be careful not to stray into the realm of certainty. You're trying to provide clarity. Let me tell you the difference. A few years back, I moved into a new role here at Chick-fil-A, and I began sharing the vision for this team. And I talked about we want more reach, we want more impact, we want higher levels of performance that we could help stir up within the organization. And somebody stopped me and they said, hold on. No. I need to know, is my job going to be continued? Is my project going to be continued? Who's my supervisor? Where am I going to sit? And I said, I don't know any of that, but let me go back and tell you what I do know. We're going to have more reach, and we're going to have more impact, and we're going to have more influence, and we're going to drive performance. Because that person, and many people, they really want certainty, but they'll settle for clarity. That first rule is aspire. You need to share your hopes and dreams for your culture. The second rule is to amplify. And just as the word implies, it really means to turn up the volume, if not literally, figuratively. There's so much noise in the world and in the workplace. Amplify is about continuously reinforcing the aspiration. Satya Nadella did this when he took over at Microsoft. He replaced Steve Ballmer, who had been their CEO for many years. And among other things, Nadella said he wanted their aspiration to be a shift from being know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. From know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. That's a pretty powerful aspiration. And to do that, he made many changes. He changed performance management systems. He changed their recruiting practices. He made all of these changes. Many of them were systemic changes. And that's great. Some changes, when you're trying to amplify, when you're trying to reinforce, are going to be more personal, one-on-one, and some are going to be organizational or systemic. Let me share one example of, I think, a very powerful move. It actually is probably the most important thing that you and I can do as leaders if we want to amplify our aspiration, and that is role modeling. We've got a chapter in the book called Follow the Leader. People always watch the leader. If you want to reinforce and amplify the aspiration, you need to pay attention to what you're doing. One of the stories I tell in the book is Alexander the Great. Some of you are history buffs and you may know this, but others may not, that he, 320-ish BC, he started a 10-year campaign. He would ultimately conquer the known world. And when in 326 BC, 8 years into the campaign, he was in a battle in modern-day Turkey with the Malians. And it was a unique opportunity. I say it was unique. It was almost his standard protocol. He always talked about valor. He talked about courage. He talked about bravery. That was the cultural aspiration. But he had this habit of fighting from the front. And on that particular day, they were trying to scale a tower, and he was not satisfied that his men were moving quick enough. So he took the ladder and he went up first. got to the top of the wall and was fighting hand to hand on the top of the wall. His men, seeing their leader on the top of the wall, stormed the ladder. They all tried to go up at once, and they broke the ladder. So Alexander, thinking, okay, it's going to be a while before they get here, did the only thing that made sense to him. He jumped inside the citadel and began fighting hand to hand with the enemy. By the time his men got over the wall, they found him on the other side with his back up against a tree, still fighting with an arrow in his side. And it was a wound that almost killed him. So here's the point. He did survive, but here's the point. It's one thing to talk about bravery and valor and courage, and it's another thing to lead from the front. He was amplifying his aspiration. So my question for you is, what are you doing to amplify your cultural aspiration? People always watch the leader. Okay, rule number 3, adapt. You must constantly be working to enhance your culture. Now, a quick word about enhancement, because this question comes up all the time. It's like, okay, what does that really mean? I give you 3 things to consider. One is, are there any critical gaps that you need to close? Just stuff that you know is not right. It's not working in your culture. You just need to fix it. The second is, are there strengths that you can leverage? If you double down on something you're good at and you get better, you're enhancing the culture. And third, are there any new capabilities that you think you might want to add to your culture? We did this 15 years ago or so when we said we want to be more innovative. It's not that we didn't have any innovators. You could argue that Truett Cathy was the original innovator for us when he invented the Chick-fil-A sandwich. But we wanted innovation to become more of our DNA, to actually embed it in our culture. And we embarked on a multi-year campaign. And I would argue that that adaptation has made us more innovative as an organization. One fun, quick story. Some of you know the name, the All Blacks, the New Zealand rugby team. Well, if you don't know their story, it's quite fascinating. Founded in 1903, by 2004, they had won almost 80% of their matches, which is staggering over virtually a 100-year period. But then they began to stumble. In fact, they began to fall. And when you read about what happened, their culture had not adapted. And they actually say, their conclusion, we needed to adapt. And there's a fantastic book called Legacy that I highly recommend. James Kerr wrote that chronicles that story and their comeback. And I will say, between 2012 and 2016, they only lost 2 matches. Think about a professional sports team that loses 2 matches in whatever, that's 5 years. Now, P.S., asterisk, they're struggling again. They're struggling again. And guess what they're talking about? They need to figure out how to adapt. To me, they're a fantastic example. Last thought before I flip it to you for questions. If you go after critical gaps, what you're really trying to do is eliminate the toxins in your culture. You know, we said that culture is an unseen force. Well, the toxins are unseen as well, but the impact and influence of the toxins is almost always evident if you're paying attention. So here's what I would ask you to consider. Are people engaged? Are they apathetic? Is there unhealthy competition? Is there paranoia? Have you lost some procedural discipline? See, a toxin is any recurring pattern of unhealthy or unproductive behavior. If you see those things, you need to try to eradicate them. So how do you do that? Well, again, a lot we could say about this, but you need an early warning system. You really need mechanisms in place to help you identify those toxins. My favorite story from history is the canary in the coal mine. Again, many of you know that story. The miners would carry a canary into the mines because they had a hypersensitivity to toxic gases. And if the canary stopped singing, everybody knew it was time to exit. But here's what would happen. From time to time, the canary didn't just stop singing, but they kind of keeled over, like they passed out. And the miners didn't want to lose the canaries. They were actually, in many cases, quite attached. So they built these little cages. They called them revival cages. And they had a glass door on the front, and the top had an oxygen tank. And when the canary would either stop singing or literally just fall over, the miners would close that door and they would turn on that oxygen. Here's why I tell you that story. When you find toxins in your organization, that does not mean that all is lost. What it means is that you have the opportunity as the leader to intervene. You control the valve. You can put pure oxygen into your organizations to eradicate the toxins and help your people thrive. So the 3 rules: aspire, amplify, and adapt. And you need all 3. You need all 3. A quick closing thought on that. Some people miss the adapt part because they get real satisfied, even complacent. When they have an aspiration, they amplify and things start to happen. Then they move into protection mode and they try to shrink wrap it. Well, if you shrink wrap your culture, you're going to suffocate it. You've got to constantly be looking for ways to enhance your culture. A healthy culture is a living, breathing organism, and you are its steward. So with that, I'm gonna hush and flip it to you guys for questions. Does anything I said stir up a question?
So Mark, before we go to questions, we do want to let folks know before we get too far in the hour, some ways that they can learn more from this new book, Culture Rules, and what they can do next. One of the things we want to encourage you to do if you're with us today is to purchase Culture Rules for yourself and your team. And if you go to the new leadeveryday.com, you can read about the bonus possibilities that you can access if you purchase the book in bulk. So we would encourage you to do that today at leadeveryday.com. We also have 2 additional learning opportunities for you, February 15th at noon Eastern and March 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern. If you are with us today, we encourage you to invite someone who you think should hear this message to come, because those upcoming events are going to be a repeat of today's content. So no need for you to sign up again, but please invite your colleagues and friends who might benefit from being with Mark live. You can also receive ongoing encouragement and inspiration for your journey from Mark's weekly e-newsletter. You can follow Mark on all your favorite social media channels, and we would appreciate you being willing to share the Culture Rules message with your friends and colleagues as you continue to learn together. So with that, we are going to take some questions. Go ahead, Mark.
Hey, Becky, let me throw one more thing out there because we've never done this before. You mentioned you're very kind and gracious. This is my 11th book, but we're trying something totally new here. We're actually doing, and you reference them, it's a pre-order incentives. Again, you can find out more on leadeveryday.com, but here I'm mentioning it. It's an experiment. It may not work, but here's what happens. If you buy a bunch of books, I'll either do a Zoom call with you and your team, or I'll get on an airplane and come to your event and speak for free. So again, maybe nobody will take us up on it, but if you want to learn more, you can go to Lead Every Day. I'm excited to see if people think that adds value.
I think it adds a tremendous amount of value, Mark, and I hope that there are some on this call who will take advantage of it. I'd like to go first to a question from Nathan. Nathan says, in your research or experience, which was the greater initial opportunity for most teams to fix the broken culture stuff or better leverage their strengths?
I think, I don't know that I would want you to choose. I mean, it's never a bad idea to leverage your strengths, but the toxins are toxic. The toxins will kill your organization if left unchecked. So again, I don't think I would ever say don't leverage your strengths, but think about it like this. If the house is on fire, that doesn't mean fire prevention is a bad idea. It means you got a fire. And so if you can begin to move against those toxins, that's going to be a really high return activity.
Thank you, Mark. From Rick, I have, what is more important to focus on, values or behavioral norms?
Okay. Did you say this is from Rick?
It is.
Rick. Okay, Rick. I think there could be some semantics at play here. Here's what you're trying to do. You're trying to help people understand what are the norms, to use a psychological term. How will we work? What types of behaviors will be honored and tolerated? And by extension, what kind of behaviors are out of bounds? And so the language is actually not as important. What's more important is how you define the language. And this is an extension to your question. It's the whole thing about vision, mission, purpose. It's like there are really smart people who define all those things differently. I'm saying pick the language that you're comfortable with and then define it for your organization and repeat it strategically forever. And so I don't think you'll go wrong with either of those terms. Clearly, if you use values, you do want them to affect people's behavior, because I think that what you believe certainly impacts how you behave.
Thank you, Mark. So we have a note from another Mark, it is not you, who says that he just finished reading the book over the weekend and it's excellent. And he's interested to hear how you see today's obsession with ESG fitting in with companies' unique cultures. I'm not sure what ESG is, so.
Yeah, tell it. I want to know I'm answering the right question.
All right. So if we can find out what ESG is from Mark, then we can move ahead on this question. While we're waiting on that, Bob is curious about this. Top-down culture change has a poor reputation. What are your thoughts?
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll have another webinar in the future about that. My team has been researching the topic of organizational change for the last few years. So I have lots I could say about that. Let me summarize it like this. Top-down change does have a poor reputation. I want to agree and honor that. However, when it succeeds, it's because leaders are well grounded in the reality of their organization, past, present, and future. Leaders who listen, leaders who adapt are the ones that have a much higher batting average when it comes to organizational change initiatives. So leaders have just got to do a better job of listening. Our research indicates that there's about a 40% gap on several topics between what the leaders think and what the frontline people think. And when you're that far out of sync with reality, it's going to be hard to get anything done, particularly the difficult things.
Thank you, Mark. From Joshua, how do you respond when a higher level leader in the organization is not mirroring the desired culture?
Well, some of that depends on where you sit in the organization. If you are a peer or a supervisor, I think you would hit those things directly. I think if you are further down in the organization, my encouragement to leaders is to always model the desired behaviors, because even though that's extremely unfortunate, and I know exactly what you're talking about, when people leave an organization, they don't really leave an organization. The data indicates they leave their supervisor. And if you're modeling the desired behaviors, you'll get a lot of credit, a lot of respect, and a lot of trust from your people. But depending on where you sit, you may have to have a different tact for dealing with that.
Thank you, Mark. So for Michael, I have, what do you find are the greatest catalysts for a culture to change? For example, COVID was a global example of a major work culture shift, but what about on a micro scale?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think COVID is a great example, because sometimes cultures change because of external factors, whether it be macro economic factors or competitive pressures. And so there are those externals. But the sole, maybe it's not sole, the primary driver of internal culture change is leadership. Leaders are the ones that set the aspiration or not. And of course, if they don't, no culture drifts to greatness, right? You drift to mediocrity. Toxins will overwhelm an organization in the absence of leadership, or I might add, in the face of poor leadership, that toxins will overtake an organization. But it's about leaders. We could not escape that in our research. We even asked people, again, all over the world, who's carries the responsibility for culture, and people at all levels say senior leaders. The senior leaders say it and see it, and the frontline people, and the frontline supervisors, and the mid-level, and the C-suite. I mean, everybody says, yeah, leaders own this. Whether they steward it well or not is kind of a different story.
All right, here's a question from Todd. How do you see the rules functioning in a nonprofit setting where leaders have less leverage?
I think they work spectacularly well in the nonprofit world, because we set out to figure out what is universally true about culture. And I would say nonprofits, many of them have a higher and more noble cause than the marketplace. So your aspiration should get people jazzed. And I think the same things that amplify an aspiration in the marketplace amplify the aspiration in ministry or nonprofit, because the two primary drivers, the two primary levers for amplification, although there are many, is one we've already mentioned, role modeling of the leader, and second is storytelling. And so I don't totally buy the premise that you've got less leverage. I think the work is usually more important than the marketplace work, which should enable you to generate more buy-in and more engagement, because the work is so important. But it'll work smashingly well.
I wasn't sure about that assumption of having less leverage in a nonprofit either, so I'm glad you pointed that out, Mark. Okay, so I have a question from Lori. How do you assess where your culture is currently?
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to listen. You got to pay attention. Again, are people doing the things you want them to do, and are they doing it the way you want those things done? I mean, behavior is the ultimate test of a culture. And so then if you don't see the things you want to see, you've got to start trying to figure out, well, why not? And I think you talk to people, you do surveys, you do focus groups. To adapt well is always preceded by listening well. And don't think about listening too narrowly. But say, if you elevate the priority of culture in your own mind, and you elevate it on your calendar, and you elevate it in your list of activities, then I think you'll be much more in tune with what is the reality of our culture. Again, are there patterns of unwanted, unhealthy, and unproductive behavior? And if you find them, you can start there. If you find several of those, you pick the biggest one and go after it first.
Well, so Nathan is sending us a softball here and asking, would the culture rules high performance checklist help us assess our team's culture?
Yes.
Maybe you can tell us what that is, Mark, for those who might not know.
We put together some questions that will help you ask some of these questions. And I bet Wendy or somebody can probably put a link up, or we can put it in the notes as to where people can find that. But it's just a simple, I think we did 8 or 10 or 12 questions that'll help you begin to think about your culture. And it's built around the 3 A's that we talked about today.
And I think that checklist is a part of the pre-order bonuses. So if you pre-order a book and fill out the form at leadeveryday.com, you'll get access to that checklist, which will help you to begin to assess your culture.
Okay. All right. Environmental social governance is okay. ESG. Okay. Yeah, we talk about all of those things. So the question is, let's go back to the question. It says investors are increasingly applying these non-financial factors as part of their analysis process to identify material risk and growth opportunities. Yes. So the short answer is there is so much data out there that organizations with healthy, thriving, dynamic cultures outperform on all measures and all metrics. So if these non-financial metrics are part of your scorecard and you build a culture aligned with those, you have a much better chance of excelling than the organizations that don't. And remember, culture is a low priority for most leaders in action. Therefore, if you make it a priority, you gain competitive advantage. I mean, the subtitle of the book is The Leader's Guide to the Ultimate competitive advantage. And so whatever's on your scorecard, you can drive it better and further and faster with a strong culture.
Thank
And
you,
again,
Mark.
let me say this. We did data, I already referenced it, and we talked to leaders and frontline folks all over the world. But there's a lot more data in the book because everybody has studied culture over the last 20 years. And kind of the jury is in. It is critical. It is essential. And most leaders know it, as I said earlier, which is why the book doesn't spend a lot of time trying to convince you culture is important. I'm trying to figure out, my team was trying to figure out how to help you create a high performance culture. And we think we've done that.
So, Mark, I want to follow up on that with a question from Aid, or maybe Abe, I'm not sure which. So what I hear you saying, Mark, is that we don't have to convince people of the importance of culture. But what would you say is responsible for the disparity between, everyone agrees that culture is important, and then a lack of organizations really adopting, improving their cultures?
Well, again, we spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. And part of it is, again, I'll reference something I said earlier. It was perceived as squishy. It was perceived as too complex and too difficult, which is why we were so excited when we said, hey, we think we can distill this down to 3 essential rules. Because the leaders I've talked to, the book hadn't even come out yet, but we've begun to share the content. And the leaders I'm talking to said, well, I can do that. I can set an aspiration. I can role model and tell stories. I can raise the flag when I think we need to adapt because I'm a listening leader anyway, and I see stuff. Sometimes, leaders actually have a sixth sense that things aren't right. Well, that's good because you need to address those things because often they're a toxin that's lurking out there in the shadows. So, if you want to go one level deeper, I think there's busyness. I think there's distractions. I think there are all kinds of things that are preventing leaders from doing what they know they need to do, which is why my last book, Smart Leadership, was really about how to escape the quicksand. You're going to have a hard time building a high performance culture if you're swimming in quicksand. So if that's your situation, you probably need to read that book first. It's about leadership effectiveness.
Well, and people can actually get that one immediately since it's already out, and then they can be ready when Culture Rules shows up. So I want to surface this question from Kelsey. She's wondering, how can I communicate a toxin in our culture to my boss that they will take action to fix the ongoing problem?
Yeah, that's too hard a question for this format. It's all about context. It's all about circumstances. But I would assume the best about your boss, or at least I would want to, that he or she wants the organization to be successful, that your boss wants to be successful. And so if you could partner with your leader and say, hey, I think I've identified something that's holding us back. What could we do together to deal with this? How could we mitigate this? How could we eliminate this? And so that's just, without knowing any of the circumstances, I would give them the benefit of the doubt and try to partner with them.
That's really good advice, Mark. Um, it's always good to assume the best, believe the best. I think that's in another one of your books. No?
Yes, yes, yes. We won't go there today.
All right. There are so many questions, Mark. I'm going to get to as many as I can. But new in from Harris is this question. Healthy cultures usually embrace an abundance mentality, perhaps even without recognizing it. How do you teach creating that abundance mentality?
Yeah, I would go back to some of the things we just talked about. I think leaders who role model that will stand out. I think people always watch the leader. I think storytelling, again, some of these mechanisms are tried and true and have been true for thousands of years. Leaders have used these mechanisms to influence people. If the leader is telling stories about an abundance mentality and win-win opportunities, I think those two things in tandem can help you move a long way down the road.
Thank you, Mark. Here's a specific question about a culture survey from Deanna. She's curious about how you share the results of a culture survey with your organization and, how important it is, the timing on sharing the feedback from a culture survey.
Okay. Let me say a word about culture surveys. There are culture surveys that you can get off the shelf, and I would just say be very careful. Be very careful. There are examples and illustrations where those work smashingly well, but typically they're ill-suited. And here's why I say that. Your metrics, your assessment of your culture needs to be aligned as tightly as possible with your aspiration. If sustainability is part of your aspiration, then you need to measure against that. If you use an off-the-shelf generic tool, then you actually won't be measuring what you want to be true about your culture. I'll give you an example. I mentioned Microsoft and Satya Nadella a moment ago. He wanted them to move from being know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. And he said, our primary metric is a growth mindset. So they use Carol Dweck's growth mindset assessment because it's in perfect alignment. If he wanted their cultural aspiration to be the most eco-friendly organization in the world, well, Carol Dweck's growth mindset is not aligned. So I know you didn't ask about that question specifically. So, but I'm a fan of custom surveys. How do you share it? We cascade it. We start with our senior leaders. And if you've got a large organization, we have it broken down by department or function so that we can give each leader the results for their team. And we take it all the way back down to the front line and say, here's what we learned. We also typically give a response either at the department level or the organizational level or both. Here are the things we're working on. Here are the things that we've extracted from this data, and we want to give you a report, and we'll report back in 6 months or whenever about the progress we've made. So long answer, it's a cascading approach that we use for communicating that data.
And what I'm taking away from that, Mark, is the importance of ensuring that whatever survey you use is customized to the values and aspirations of your organization.
Yeah, that's my bias. And I'm excited. We just did our corporate one. We haven't seen the results yet, but we had over 90% complete the survey. You'd love 100%, but you get over 90% of the people. And I think that's an indicator of a healthy culture right there, when more than 90% of the people want to give you feedback on the culture.
Yes, that's amazing. Well, here's a question from Steve. Does the culture need to change as the goals of the organization change?
Maybe. Goals can be part of the cultural aspiration, or they can run in tandem. So if an organization wants to be the most eco-friendly organization in the world, and that's part of their cultural aspiration, and they update their sales goals, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to change the aspiration. So there could be examples when President Kennedy wanted to put men on the moon and return them safely before the end of the decade. That was the aspiration, and it drove NASA for years and years and years and years. Many historians believe that one reason NASA struggled post-moon landing was there was no next. There was no, okay, what's the new aspiration? So if your aspiration or your goal, if they're intertwined, then certainly you would need a new aspiration when you accomplish that goal. But they can work in tandem.
Thank you. One more question, I think, and we are open to a few more. So if you have additional questions, or if I somehow missed your question, please go ahead and copy it back to the bottom of the chat for me. But I have from Herman, how do you address hypocrisy in leaders' behaviors when you're trying to build a healthy culture?
You said that's from Herman?
Yes.
Herman, that is a fantastic question. And that is a really, really, really hard question. Yeah, I love Q&A, and then I hate Q&A because I want to be careful that I don't give you a 10-cent answer to $1 million question.
I held that one back for a while for a reason.
Yeah. I think you got to have, somebody needs to have a courageous conversation with a leader or leaders, because toxins left unchecked become maladies. It can become a full-blown, even terminal illness within a culture. In the book, we talk about some of those where there were situations that were not dealt with, and ultimately the companies imploded. We have several of those examples in the book. So I would say if there's hypocrisy there, that there are going to have to be some courageous conversations. I'm not saying you're the guy to do it, Herman, depending on where you sit within the organization, but you've got to deal with it, because that is at least a toxin, or worse, depending on how deep rooted it is and how widespread it is, how prevalent it is, because at some point you'll lose the fellowship of the people. Now, they may stay on the payroll. There's something worse than people quitting and leaving. It's they quit and they stay. And that happens a lot if you don't deal with the toxins. So I think the only answer I can come up with in the moment is that there are going to have to be some courageous conversations.
And Mark, James is asking if you could clarify the definition of a toxin.
A toxin is any reoccurring pattern of unhealthy or unproductive behavior. So if you see unhealthy competition, and it's not an outlier, it's not a random deal, or you see paranoia, or you see apathy, or you see, again, I mentioned loss of procedural discipline. There's a list in the book. You can make your own list, but things that aren't right, that will ultimately eat away at the very core of your culture and impede you from achieving your aspiration. Those are the things that you gotta sniff them out, and you gotta deal with them.
Thank you, Mark. So as we come near to the end of the hour, I want to encourage you to stay on until the very end, because we have a fun way for you to give us some feedback about this event in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to tell you some other next steps in case you missed these earlier. Here's some ways that you can continue to learn from Mark Miller and Culture Rules. The first is to purchase Culture Rules for yourself and your team. And as Mark mentioned, there are some amazing, valuable bonuses available at leadeveryday.com, including having Mark for a private Zoom event with your team, or having him show up in person at your event, depending on the level of books that you buy.
Let me say something about that, Becky, and help me with the numbers, maybe you or Wendy. I think for me to do a Zoom call with your team, isn't it like 15 books, 12 books. I mean,
It,
it's
it,
not
it
many
it's
books.
it's a pretty low number, Mark. And I was
11,
kind
it
of
says
shaking. I was shaking in my
11.
boots about how you're going to do all of that. So yes, I
We
wasn't
buy
going to call
11
attention.
books. No,
11
I mean, I
books.
want to call it out. I mean, I'd love to talk with your team and help any way I can.
So buy at least 11 books and you can get Mark live with your team. I think it's 500 if you want to have Mark in person for free with your group. We would also invite you to celebrate launch day. We are going to have a Zoom meeting where everyone will be face to face with Mark. And if you want to meet him and ask more questions, we would encourage you to come to that launch day celebration with us on March 7th at noon Eastern, which is the day that the book will be released. We encourage you to stay connected in an ongoing way by signing up to receive Mark's weekly e-newsletter. Follow Mark on all your favorite social media channels, including TikTok, if you're there. And we would also welcome anything you can do to help us share this powerful culture rules message with your friends and colleagues. So as we wrap up the hour together, Mark is going to send us out with some parting inspiration. But before we do that, we want to invite your participation with a Menti, which I'm going to invite you to participate in. You'll see that come up in your Zoom app. And we would like to know, what is your greatest takeaway today about culture from today's event? And I'm going to leave that open for just a few moments, and you'll see the invitation to participate, and you'll be able to type in your answer, and we should all be able to see that together. If you can let me know in the chat if it's not working as you expect, but we would love to see your greatest takeaways in the Menti for today's event. And, I'm personally really, really excited about the upcoming events that we have. Let me just make sure that I did that correctly. I'm going to try one more time because I don't see any answers coming in. So let's see, we are going to invite you to participate in the Menti. Let's just make sure that you are invited, and then we'll go back to that together. Okay, so please share your takeaways from today's event. And if you have benefited from today's event, we would encourage you to invite your friends, colleagues, family, anyone you can think of to these upcoming learning events. We have 2 more webinars like this one, plus that launch party on March 7th. So hopefully we'll be able to see those greatest takeaways flood in. I know, Mark, you wanted to send us out with some inspiration as well.
Well, just a final word. Some of you have seen the movie Ready Player One by Steven Spielberg. Others read Ernest Cline's book by the same name. And I want to draw your attention, if you're not familiar with the story, and let me give you a really, really quick setup. Wade Watts is the hero of the book, and he lives in 2 worlds. He lives in the real world, and he lives in a virtual online world, as many do. This is set in the future, and a lot of people are going to that online world as a way to escape. And so Wade is talking about this online space. It's called the Oasis, and he says this. Said people go to the Oasis because of what they can do, and they stay because of who they can become. And as I think about your culture, I think about our culture. Wouldn't it be amazing if we created a place where people would be drawn to it because of what they could do, and they stay because of who they can become? That's my story. It may be your story. Those types of cultures are within our grasp. It's all up to you. Leaders animate culture. Thanks for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you on a future broadcast. Thanks for putting things in the Mentimeter. I will study all of this. Thanks.